6 again. What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the most awesomest homesteading channel on the planet. That typically doesn't have a daggum thing to do with homesteading whatsoever. Homesteading off the grid. So folks, it's been close to a week since I've come out and made a video. A lot of y'all like the last one. We talked a little bit about Bigfoot Sasquatch, had a really great story about that. And, you know, you go through the comments, you go through the responses. A lot of folks, they have their stories. A lot of folks are like, wow, that was a great one, and I believe every word of it. And then you got the naysayers, the negative Neds, the doubting Thomases, all these and whatnot. And folks, FYI, it's like 90 degrees plus here right now. It is officially summer in Virginia. Not really officially, but man, we complain in May because you don't know if you should wear your winter coat out or your tank top. It turns out you need both, but man, by the time June gets here, laws. Anyway, that's a southern way of taking the Lord's name in vain without taking the Lord's name in vain. I said laws. Okay, so anyway, a lot of people ask, they'll say, well, you know, if he, she, it, or they actually exists, and I'm not talking about 72 different genders that for this strange 4-year period in U.S. history supposedly existed. I'm talking about Bigfoot Sasquatch. If he, she, it, or they actually exist, how come nobody's ever found the bodies? Well, how many elephant graveyards have they found, brah? But I've got an even better case in point than that, and I'm here to share it with you today. This is a story called This Is How They Hid the Bodies, okay? And it's one of hundreds of stories from Bigfoot Sasquatch Files Anthology 1. This Bible of Bigfoot Sasquatch includes the first 10 volumes of the 15-volume series Bigfoot Sasquatch Files, all in one. It is available on Amazon, print and Kindle, or you can get an autographed copy from our Etsy store. The links for both are in the description box below. But this is a beautiful story. It tells you exactly why nobody's found any skeletal remains or the bodies of the Bigfoot Sasquatches, at least in one particular location. So, as my beautiful bride dearly aka Giggly Girl, would say, with no further ado, I'm going to get to the story. But for those of you who aren't familiar with this channel, we call her Giggly Girl because that's what she does. She just giggles all the time. Look at that sweat glistening off my hairy as an ape forearm. All right, almost let one slip. This is how they hid the bodies. They'd known each other since kindergarten, and they'd loved each other for just as long. The only reason he bit her arm in the first grade and got sent to the principal's office for doing it was because she'd asked him to. And she'd only asked because she wanted proof that he'd do whatever she said, no matter how ridiculous the request. And she got it that day, and his loyalty never swayed from that moment on, despite 3 slick licks he took across the backside. The only reason he'd granted her strange request was because he wanted to show her at the ripe young age of 6 that he'd do anything she asked and grant her any wish her heart desired. Besides, he didn't bite her hard enough to hurt her anyway, didn't even break the skin. And they both knew what that meant. Any request made, any request granted. Oh, how she loved to torment him in middle school by returning the flirtations from the high school boys while walking to and fro the schoolhouse. But only when he was with her, and only for confirmation that he really cared, even though she never doubted that he did. If she was alone and the older boys flirted, she ignored them, because she too was loyal and always faithful. When he'd asked her to marry him after graduation, before actually, though they couldn't tell their parents of such poppycock, she'd said yes, and they'd even set a date. But the planes came over and bombed the harbor, and Uncle Sam made different plans for them. She used her time while awaiting his return, praying for it every night wisely. She kept busy in an ill attempt to keep her mind from wondering about what he might be going through by going to college and getting a degree. She got a degree in teaching from a normal school, as they were known back then at those times, and it only took 2 years back then, and just as she was finishing up, he was making his way back home. Physically, he was fine, and whatever wars would forever fight in his mind, he kept it to himself, except for the times of the nightmares. She cried for him at night when those came, but she always made sure never to tell him of them during the day. She figured those were his times of respite from the memories when he was awake. That's when he had a say in keeping them away. But she often wondered about it during the times he drifted off, wide awake, distant and away in his mind. Even then, she gave him his space. They'd gone through heartache when they discovered they couldn't conceive, and back in those days, the medical people couldn't tell who's at fault, as the folks these days would say, or back in those days at least, like there had been someone to blame. They both shed tears for what would never be, but then took it in stride and decided that the Almighty simply wanted them to love on each other uninterruptedly without having to share their love with little ones. So they did just that for more than 50 years. She retired from teaching and he from selling insurance, and they'd saved way more money than most couples with such middle-class incomes could have imagined. But hey, when you're not spending $250,000 to raise a child to the age of 18, each pop, converted to today's dollars, of course, such things are possible. They decided to spend the inheritance for which they had no heirs to leave, so they moved back to their native Virginia, and they bought the most beautiful 600 acres parcel of land sitting right at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains that anyone could imagine laying eyes upon. They knew it to be true because it was where they'd grown up, and despite him having been around the world, albeit behind the sights of a .50 caliber machine gun, and both of them having been all around the U.S., they'd never seen any place as pretty. And that's when it all started to happen. You'll have to forgive this brief interruption, folks. I've got to wipe the sweat off of my nose. I'm going to lose my glasses. And I don't want to say the years have caught up with me. Gravity's caught up with me, and somehow I can't see as well. Gravity. I can't jump as high, I can't run as fast, and I can't see as well. I blame gravity. Most people blame age. Not me, because I am of the firm conviction, and I have this confirmed to me daily throughout the week when I go work out at the gym and I see people in their 70s and 80s, some of them lifting more weight than me, that you don't stop playing because you get old. You get old because you stop playing. So what's going on here? That's not because of age. This is because of gravity. Yeah, that's why I can't dunk the ball anymore. Oh yeah, and because I never could anyway, but on with the story. They discussed virtually everything throughout the years, but one topic they'd never breached was aging and how it was possible that their minds might go once it began to happen, this dreaded thing called aging. How ironic, I just talked about that. Wow. If anyone had asked either of them anything along these lines, they would not have been surprised to find that both held deep fear for him and none for her. Sure, all those years as a public school teacher came with plenty of stressors, but she'd taught during the time when a teacher could still take a board across a youngster's ass if need be and not get sued or be imprisoned, though she never had to because parents could freely do the same, and they did back in those days, meaning that by the time their kids even got to school, they knew how to mind their P's and Q's. This is back, folks, during the time when disciplining your children was not considered child abuse. So it came as quite a surprise when she began acting a bit odd, drifting off into the vast forest surrounding the relatively small cleared portion of their land, the part where they'd built their dream house, staying gone sometimes for hours, the whole while never having even mentioned to the love of her life that she was heading out for a stroll. The first few times it happened, he wouldn't have known because he'd been out himself, running errands or some sort or another, out hunting deer or turkeys, and always wondering just what in the hell those strange mounds he'd stumble over on certain parts of his land might be. So the first time he actually took note of it, his wife's odd behavior, it scared him out of his wits. "Looks like that Clinton fellow from down in Arkansas is going to pull it off," he said while reading the paper one morning. She'd been in the other room tidying up after breakfast. "They say he's leading among women 'cause he's the best-looking candidate since Kennedy," he said, laughing lightly afterward. "What do you think?" After waiting for a reply and not getting one, he asked again, "Do you think this Slick Willie guy's cute, hun?" Again, no reply, so he rose to his feet and ventured into the kitchen, only to find it empty and to see the back door open. He walked out back just in time to see her slipping into the woods on the far side of the field, nearly 200 yards away. He yelled for her, but she didn't answer, so he closed the door behind himself and took off at a jog, at least as much as a jog as he could muster for his years. No matter where you go, you always have at least one heckler. "Wait up," he yelled a couple of times as he crossed the field. It was to no avail. She was too deep inside the woods now to hear him. He entered the forest, and though the morning's light was bright, it was nearly as dark as dusk underneath the heavy canopy. It was damp, humid, almost sticky. Typical summer morning in Virginia. Typical freaking early evening too, brah. "Hun," he called, louder, cupping his hands and then repeating the effort in several directions. "Hun!" She did not answer. He looked for tracks but saw none. Not only was the ground firm here, the result of no rain in more than a week, but it was heavily covered with last fall's leaves, and she barely weighed 100 pounds anyway, so she'd be hard set to leave tracks under any conditions. He continued moving through the forest, not knowing exactly where to go, and then he heard it. A knock. A tree knock. For some reason, as his mind saw it at least, his wife had decided to pick up a stick and bang on the side of a tree rather than simply answering his calls by yelling in return. He followed the direction of the sound and then he heard it again, this time closer. He knew he was getting closer to his wife because she had to be the one doing this knocking, right? "Hun," he said, when he'd made it to the top of the slight knoll and could see his wife standing not far away, below. She was standing with her back turned to him, looking up the hill, the opposite direction from which he'd come, mesmerized. She paid no attention to him as he approached. And then he heard the third knock. He stopped, frozen in his tracks, suddenly realizing it had not been his beautiful bride of all these years who'd done the knocking. His eyes followed her gaze to the top of the hill, and for the rest of his days he'd swear, never laying his hand on a Bible to do it, because he was too good of a Christian for that, but he would swear to it without one, that he saw someone or something large and dark ducking its head behind a tree. "Let's get you home, hun," he said, drawing up to her quickly after seeing what he'd thought he'd seen and putting his arm around her, and he turned her toward the direction from which he'd come. It was as if she came too at the same time. "Did you see him?" she asked. "I saw something," he said, leading her out of the area and back to what he'd hoped was the safety of their house. "They're coming in closer," she said. Neither of them spoke again until they'd gotten home and went inside and locked the doors. "I'm telling you," she said, glass of cold water in hand, "it's the forest people." He'd looked into her eyes and he'd noticed that they weren't glossy. They didn't seem to have the faraway look of folks who were slipping in their minds. He could still remember that look distinctly from back when his grandparents had it, though. It was nearly his entire lifetime ago. As far as he could tell, his wife's mental health was not off, and in a different way, this concerned him even more. "Sometimes I can feel them calling to me," she said, taking another sip of water and then handing him the glass. "It's hard to explain. It's like I just know they're there and they want me to come to them." "Like with the kids," he said. "Little Missy and the other ones?" "Yes," she said, "very similar to that." Despite the fact that she'd taught school during simpler times and when children, and their parents for that matter, seemed to be much more disciplined and respectful than many children and parents of today, and people seemed to have more character in general, there was the occasional bad apple. Little Missy, as her husband had referred to her, was the little girl she'd once taught back in the early 1960s. She was a well-disciplined little girl. She was clean and appeared to be well kept, and she was one of the brightest kids in the class. Never a problem. Yet every time she looked little Missy's way, it was as if she could hear the little girl's voice in her mind saying, "Help me." She knew that if she were to tell anyone of this, what seemed to be the ability to read a little girl's mind, they'd write her off as mad, so she didn't. She kept it to herself, but she paid attention to it, this strange ability she seemed to possess, and she continued to listen to Missy's voice, and eventually she acted. One particular day, when little Missy's voice seemed to be particularly loud in her mind, she pulled Missy aside during recess in such a way that none of the other children would notice, and she asked her if she was okay. Missy told her the most nightmarish stories of how her mother rented her out to her man friends, as the little girl put it, on the weekends, and since it was Friday, she didn't want to go home. She assured Missy that it would be okay to go home and not to worry. Just go home and act as if everything was okay, and that she'd take care of it all for her. She would never have to fear weekends again. Around 9 p.m. that evening, the local police, acting on what would forever be referred to only as an anonymous tip, when the story was told originally or retold hundreds of times over the years that followed, appeared at Missy's mother's house, and Missy's woes came to an abrupt end, and though the girl no doubt was scarred for life, those woes did end. And then there'd been Tommy, the boy always covered with bruises because he was always running into things. An anonymous tip would save him from an abusive drunken stepfather. And her abilities as an empath would later save little Sarah from a much older stepbrother who couldn't seem to keep his hands or other body parts to himself. "You never really believed those stories, did you?" her husband finally said, referring to the forest people she'd mentioned, not her strange abilities. He never doubted those. I mean, those were just the stories our parents and grandparents told us when we were kids about these forest people, these creatures. "I never believed or disbelieved," she said, remembering being told the stories quite well during her childhood, especially when it was bedtime and she didn't want to go to sleep. "I was always intrigued, and I always viewed it as if most anything's possible." Both of their families had already lived down in the valley, but they remembered when they'd been grade school children themselves in the 1930s, the slew of families being driven from the mountaintops in order for the government to build the Blue Ridge Parkway. A lot of the families held out as long as they could, some of them being forced out at the end of the gun barrels before they'd leave. There were stories of some families, way back in the sticks, who were supposedly protected by the people of the forest, or the forest people. The words were always interchangeable, but they had the same meaning. Who would act on behalf of the locals? Squatters, the government men would call them. They would pull pranks on them, often disabling their vehicles or throwing rocks at them during the day or night. Oh, and the sheer terror they would inflict upon them when darkness fell with their ear-shattering screams. Stories for another time. Supposedly, some of the locals were way deep back in the woods, actually were able to remain on their land because of the efforts of the forest people. Every now and then, a hiker who gets too far off the beaten trails, as the government men would later come through and cut out through what they'd call the Shenandoah National Park, they'll find old homesteads. Sometimes they find the old houses, wells, frames from old vehicles, and even every now and then, old family cemeteries. And sometimes they even found bones. "I know I'm getting old," she said, "and I know you have your worries. Trust me, I have mine for you. But I'm telling you, this is not dementia. My mind's as sharp as it's ever been." "I'll take your word for it," he said, and he meant it. He remembered distinctly when she told him about the children way back when. He never doubted her then, as odd as those stories had sounded, so he wasn't about to doubt her now. Besides, he had fought in Japan, and he helped liberate the Philippine Islands before that, and he saw stuff over there that no one in Western culture would ever believe. And he knew they wouldn't believe it because he used to tell people about some of those things after he'd come home from the war. And he learned quickly to stop telling those stories when the people he told them to would hear him out and tell him he was crazy. So he had no doubt, back when she'd told him, that his wife probably did possess an ability the majority of people simply didn't. And as they always say, the proof is in the pudding, and it all panned out when those anonymous tips were followed up by the authorities. As it turned out, that good-looking, smooth talker from Arkansas did push the man who'd reneged on his claim of no new taxes. Read my lips. Well, the good looker from Arkansas beat him, pushed him out of office, and the aged couple, lovers since childhood, would spend most of the 8 years he'd spent in office together on their extremely large tract of land nestled in the foothills of the beautiful Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia, ever so close to their childhood homes. They'd gone through the occasional spells of heading down into Charlottesville to be social, perhaps make new friends in their retirement, but no matter where they went or who they met, they always returned home much earlier than they'd planned and spent their time together watching the sunsets. One beautiful Saturday morning, a crisp fall day, they decided to drive into town to support the local college during a football game. Folks, I did not plan to wear this shirt. Of course, I guess when half of your apparel has something to do with UVA football, you got a 50-50 chance of making it happen, right? As the band played, well, but loudly, during a beautiful halftime show for the crowd of nearly 40,000, they looked at each other and with their eyes agreed to leave. They went, well, I'm sure we were getting the hell blown out of us by some ACC team like Clemson or maybe even Virginia Tech. They went home and sat back on that beautiful front porch of theirs, and one with the even more beautiful view and the one where they spent most of their time, weather permitting, and watched the leaves turn from green to gold, red, orange, and yellow. It was a better show than the band's field performance, entertaining and near excellent as it was. As they spent their years together on their land, loving each other as much in their old age as they had in their youth, they noticed how many of the large properties around them were changing, and not for the better, at least in their opinions. As the land values in the local real estate market skyrocketed, many families whose land had been in the family for many generations were being forced to sell their land, or at least the majority of it, as the patriarch and matriarch generation, proud members of the World War II generation, much like themselves, were dying off to appease the estate taxes. Sure, on paper, these baby boomers inheriting the land were loaded. Anyone who owned even 100 acres of land in the area where raw land out in the sticks sold for $30,000 per acre were worth $3 million. But these were common folk. They were farmers. And if they worked away from home, they worked down at the public utilities for about $40,000 a year because a cousin of a cousin knew someone who had a cousin who worked there and who could get them a job because their cousin wasn't hiring. These were not rich people when it came to liquidity. As a result, when mom and pop died, the government men came around with their hands out, looking for 50% of the value of their land to redistribute to the masses who needed it so much more than the families who'd lived on it for generations. They didn't have it to give, and the family had to sell the land to satisfy these taxes. The result of this redistribution of wealth, was the tearing down of the most beautiful forests, the digging up of the most beautiful grazing fields, and the construction of the most god-awful looking subdivisions in the history of America. Oh, but how so many of the young middle-class yuppies loved living in them. Around the time talk started up about the son of that one guy who'd reneged on the no new taxes running for office to avenge his father's loss, and who would win and then go on to avenge his father in Iraq for a time, she began spending a little more time than usual in the woods alone. They'd spent plenty of time walking in the woods together through the years, but he knew they'd only speak to her, or however it was they communicated with her. He never really understood when she was alone, this being the forest people. "We got to figure something out," she said one evening. They were sitting on the porch, sipping iced tea, watching the fireflies sporadically lighting up the fields as the sun slipped behind the hills. "We can't let them come in here and tear this place down and throw up those overpriced cookie-cutter McMansions. It's their home." And he knew exactly who she meant by "their." It wasn't the yuppies, it was the forest people. They'd talk during their walks, and they'd talk while they sat on the porch of all the ways they could protect the land. Try as they might, they couldn't seem to come up with a way to protect the property from the inevitable. They'd had their hopes up about the guy who was taking his daddy's old job in the White House because he'd spoken of eliminating the estate tax, but as it was, once he'd gotten elected into the swamp, he did little more than swim with the alligators that were already in it, and he'd settled for simply waiving the estate tax up to the first $1.3 million worth of real property, cash, and assets. That would do them no good. The couple wasn't so much worried about the continuation of the existence of the forest people, should their forest become a yuppified subdivision, because the forest people had proven for much longer than the U.S. had even been a country that they were adaptable. They were resourceful. They'd always been able to adjust to the changes forced upon them by mankind. However, there was a particular part of the property that was sacred, a specific location that the couple felt needed to remain untouched. The family cemetery. The family cemetery of the forest people. Yes, on the far back part of their property, a near 2-hour hike due to the sheer incline, all through extremely rough terrain, and it was the only way to get there, there was a dip in the land. The dip was not on the top of a ridge, but about 50 yards below it. And if one was standing on top of the ridge looking down, they'd never see it. It was the perfect location. The ground itself here appeared as if a massive giant had taken a giant tablespoon and taken a huge scoop right out of the earth. More than likely, millions of years ago, a meteor had hit the ground at the location, carving out the deep indentation. Overhead of this hole, wild grapevines and Virginia creeper grew so thick that if you were to top the ridge looking down into the dip, you'd never even notice the change in the topography. From above, the vines looked like the surface of the ground. One could not tell that they were the canopy of the dipped area beneath them, an area approximately half the size of a football field. An area that had no less than 40 graves of the forest people. It's a Bigfoot Sasquatch burial ground, folks, if you haven't figured it out. Brah. The only thing they couldn't figure out about the plan they came up with, ingenious if they didn't say so themselves, was which one of them would pass first. It was more than just the "I hope I die first because I can't imagine spending a day without you" kind of things they jokingly said, but absolutely meant. And they always made sure to change the subject before they spent too much time on it, that they actually started thinking about it too much, because they both knew the time was inevitable and drawing near. There was also the morbid curiosity over whom the park would be named after, him or her. "It's not morbid," she'd say to him when they spoke of it, which was often. "How can we not be curious? It's only natural." "I don't know," he'd say. "It just brings back so many memories, bad ones, like talking to my battle buddies back in the war about who was going to mail those letters home for them. The death letters to the families." "Wow," she'd say, and when he'd told her this, they'd actually been out in the forest behind their home that morning, hoping for a glimpse of the forest people. She almost always saw or heard them when she was alone, but they rarely did when he was with her. He never took it personal. He fully understood that she was an empath, and he knew full well that he was not. "So who'd you write your letter to?" she'd asked him that day when it had come up. "Me or your mother?" "Neither," he said, without a moment's hesitation. "I didn't write no damn death letter." "Really?" she said, surprise in her voice. "Dying was never something I considered to be an option," he'd told her. "I saw myself making it home, and I wasn't about to have a plan B, so I never wrote the damn letter, and let's change the subject." And they did. As fate would have it, the park would be renamed after her, though she didn't have to wait long for him to get there, wherever there was, to join her. He passed only 6 months after cancer came quick and took her away from him just as quickly. There was plenty of pain, despite how some might like to fantasize there is such a thing as a painless death by the way of the big sea, but he'd been happy that it hadn't lasted long. She went quick, and he went in his sleep, the way he'd always boasted he wished to die, if ever asked, and he went with a smile on his face. And the county, to whom he donated the land, put up a trail park in her name, since she'd been the one who'd gone first, and he stayed behind for all the paperwork and the official dedication. Per the stipulation of the gift of the land, all of their land, the couple had made to the county, there was never to be allowed any hunting or straying from the main trails, which the county kept well cleared and clearly marked, and there was never to be any construction of any kind, and to this day, nearly 20 years after their passing, there hasn't been. It's called a conservation easement, folks. The yuppies came from far and wide to hike the rugged trails which led up the steep mountainside with its beautiful views at the peaks, especially the peak that has the steep drop down into what looks like nothing but tangles and brambles and briars and vines, at least from above. And they take their group pictures of families and friends, and those who got it alone take plenty of selfies, or those who go there alone take plenty of selfies. None of them realizing that down there in the backdrop of all those photos they're putting all over their social media sites and pages are graves. And that's exactly how they hid the bodies. The end. And yeah, Biznitches, I wrote that. It's part of the largest collection of Bigfoot Sasquatch stories ever published in the English language in the history of mankind. Modern man's been around for roughly 30,000 years. It's available on Amazon in print and Kindle, or on Etsy if you want me to autograph it for you. The links are in the description box below. Half the stories are mine, written either based upon personal experiences or just my writing ability. And the other half were actually submitted by viewers like you, potentially you if you submitted one of those stories, with permission to put in that, in that collection of stories. They're great. I mean, if you like Bigfoot Sasquatch and you like Bigfoot Sasquatch stories and you want to, tell a good story around a campfire, one hot summer night, I'd highly recommend you get a copy. But whether you do or whether you don't, and if you want to hear more from these, or more of these stories from this anthology, let me know in the comment section below. Let me know if you like that one, and if enough of y'all want to hear some more, well, I don't got no problem coming out here and telling them to you. I'll see you for more next time. From the greatest homesteading channel on planet Earth. I mean, the absolute greatest. As long as you take into consideration it doesn't really have anything to do with homesteading. I mean, whatever. Homesteading off the grid. See you for more next time.